Hey guys, Endless here, welcome back to the channel. This is part 4 for What If Deku has Requip magic. Also check out the other videos on my playlist. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoy. Izumi stared at an unconscious Lily and sighed. She had been by her side ever since she came in here. The scarlet-haired girl tried to visit Aizawa, but they didn't let her. Recovery Girl had told her that he needed surgery and wouldn't be healed for another week. Also, All Might had tried his best to get the scarlet-haired girl out of the infirmary, but he quickly stopped when Izumi had 20 swords aimed at him. She stared at her fists in contemplation. Should I have went for the kill on the Nomu or let it live? What am I going to do when I see the doctor? Will I snap and kill him? As she was in her thoughts, there was a knock on the door. Izumi growled and spoke. I told you, Dad, I am not leaving this room. However, she quickly looked away when the redhead saw who was at said door. Seagrain coughed into his fist. He noticed the bags under her eyes and frowned. Has she not slept at all? However, after a moment he spoke calmly. You know she isn't going to wake up any sooner if you stay here all the time. The scarlet-haired girl muttered something under her breath and looked towards her unconscious friend. After a moment of silence, she spoke in a defeated tone. If I was faster, this wouldn't have happened. She was about to continue, but Seagrain put a finger over her lips and spoke up once again. No need to be so down, after all she is still alive. Izumi's face turned the same color as her hair and she found the floor very interesting all of a sudden. Seagrain offered her a hand and spoke. Come on, I have something to show you. Before the scarlet-haired girl could reply, he took her hand and muttered. Meteor. Izumi closed her eyes and after a moment, she glared at the man and launched a punch to the top of his head. Slam. The floor beneath Seagrain cracked and he muttered. Why did you hit me? Said man was now bleeding on top of the head. She huffed and looked away. Don't teleport me like that when I'm not ready. As an afterthought, she wondered why she didn't feel any whiplash from moving at such high speeds. The number 3 hero had quickly stood up like nothing had happened. And he gestured her to follow him. She did so, and after a minute or so of walking, Seagrain opened the door to a room, and Izumi almost had stars in her eyes at the sight. The blue-haired man then spoke. I had this made for you, I implanted my power within it. He then muttered. It took quite a bit to fill that thing up, but it should regenerate its power on its own. She stared at him in surprise. Why, you already gave me the purple kimono. Requip. Seagrain smiled slightly when the light disappeared, and she is now wearing said kimono. Because I won't be able to protect you all the time, so this is my way of fighting alongside you. And if it ever gets too low on power, I will know and I will instantly teleport over to you. She stared at the armor in wonder, and after a moment of silence, Izumi smiled and hugged Seagrain, and said man froze at the unexpected hug. She then let go and walked over towards the armor, and said armor glowed for a moment. However, after the yellow light died down, the armor wasn't there anymore, and Izumi muttered. Requip celestial armor. This armor takes the form of a revealing blue garb with a golden chain collar around the neck area, along with diamond earrings and matching colored hair accessories. On her legs are 2 large diamond patches, while around her arms are cape-like garments to complete her armor's design while not providing any footwear. Izumi smiled and spoke, all the while looking at said armor. I like it. Seagrain smiled and replied. I will show you some of my moves, you should be able to do them. Izumi grinned at the challenge, but she yawned and spoke up. Can we fight tomorrow? I want to practice. At his nod, Izumi muttered. Requip. The scarlet-haired girl is now wearing a small cap on her head and is in pajamas. Seagrain walked over towards her and spoke a little scared. Are you going to hit me again if I teleport you? Said girl just shook her head in the negative and grabbed onto his hand. After Izumi had did this, Seagrain muttered. Meteor. But now we skip to the next day. The scarlet-haired girl stretched and was now in her backyard. Standing across from said girl was Seagrain. He stared at her and asked, "You ready?" He then continued, "My quirk isn't that easy to control." Izumi just grinned at this and shouted, "Requip celestial armor." She then moved her hands to her side and 2 lights had appeared. 2 silver-winged swords. The scarlet hair girl then roared, "Meteor!" Seagrain just stood calmly and held back his chuckle. Izumi had smashed into a tree that was right beside him. Said girl rubbed her head and pouted towards Seagrain. "You didn't say it was that hard to control." Jalal just laughed at this and replied, "Why don't we just work our way up and see if that helps?" At Izumi's nod he got into a stance and smirked. Said girl changed her swords to a spear and she muttered, "Lightning Empress Spear." Seagrain raised an eyebrow at this and roared, "Meteor." Izumi aimed her staff towards the ground and smashed it into said ground not a moment later, which left a loud boom. Then not a second later, lightning had appeared all around her. Seagrain laughed and backed away from Izumi. So you're making a defensive move, an offensive one, not bad." He then put his arms in a cross and roared, "Let the 7 stars lay judgment on you." Grand Chariot. After Izumi had noticed this she muttered, "Meteor." She was now able to move in a straight line and she appeared behind Seagrain all the while having Flame Empress sword in her left hand. The scarlet-haired girl roared and launched her blade towards the blue-haired man. In response said man muttered, "Meteor," and dodged the flames that were sent his way that left a boom. As this was happening, All Might was just sipping his tea with Nizu at his side. Said Chimera stared at the number 1 and asked, "You don't care that they are destroying your backyard?" Toshinori sipped his tea and winced when Izumi kicked Seagrain into a group of 3 trees. He then replied after a moment, "I'd rather her be out here than being locked up in her friend's room." Nizu nodded and handed All Might a letter. Said man looked at the letter and almost spit out his tea. "Wait, why is the Hero Association pushing for her to get a provisional license?" The Chimera responded with a frown on his face. "It somehow got out that Izumi is your daughter, and the press knows about her power." In another city Tamura sneezed. Anyways, All Might responded after a moment. "When are we going to tell her about this, and when are they going to set it up for her?" "After the sports festival she will take the provisional license exams." All Might frowned and stared back at the fight. Izumi had changed her sword to Water Empress Sword. Said girl shouted, "Let the 7 stars rain judgment on you." Grand Chariot. Seagrain's eyes went wide and he muttered, "Maybe I shouldn't have gave her this armor." He jumped to the side and as he dodged there was a massive boom. They were about to keep going, but that's when All Might spoke up. "Alright now you both don't want to destroy the whole house, do you?" As he said this he pointed at the stray attacks that hit the home. Izumi just chuckled nervously. "Sorry, my aim wasn't that good with this armor." As this was happening Seagrain just nodded his head in agreement. All Might just muttered something under his breath and spoke in a commanding tone. "Go fight on the mountains if you two want to spar." Izumi smiled and grabbed onto Seagrain, who for his part just saluted to All Might. The scarlet-haired girl then muttered, "Meteor." As the two left in a golden light All Might sighed. Nizu came up to his side and asked, "So when is the wedding?" The number 1 hero paled and thought. "Wait, are they dating?" He then thought about how Seagrain is and shook his head. Knowing him he would probably wait until she graduates. All Might then looked at his stomach and rubbed his wound unconsciously. After all, if it wasn't for him I would probably have less time in this form. Flashback to the fight against All for One, All Might roared as he launched a punch towards the symbol of evil. Said man caught the punch and grinned. "Are you mad that I killed your sensei, All Might?" As he said this he roared. Air cannon, plus kinetic booster. The number 1 hero jumped away and roared. Detroit Smash. The two attacks collided and caused a massive boom that shook the entire city and made a crater beneath them. All Might looked around and thought, good thing we had the civilians evacuate. However, as he looked away, All for One appeared in front of him and roared. Don't take your eyes off your opponent. As he launched a blow towards All Might's head, said hero froze. Is this it? Does one for all die with me? However, the blonde heard a roar behind him. Let the 7 stars have judgment on you. Seagrain then roared. Grand Chariot. The attack connected with All for One with 7 consecutive. Boom. Said man flew back and growled while spitting out some blood. Lucky attack, Brad, it won't happen a guy dash. However, he got cut off by Simon, who appeared at his side with his teleportation. He launched a punch towards All for One, and as Simon did so his arm lit up with darkness. Boom. Simon jumped back and was now standing next to All Might. Said hero yelled at the two brats. You both are just my interns, don't get involved. He then continued. This fight isn't yours, go back with the heroes. However, as he said this, a pissed off All for One roared. You think I'm going to let those two brats leave All Might? Said hero frowned and muttered something under his breath. Seagrain glanced at his friend and looked back towards All Might. We can give you an opening to finish this fight. As they said this, All for One shouted. Air cannon. Simon and Jalal jumped to the side and rushed towards the symbol of evil. The blue-haired boy then muttered. Pleiades. As he said this, 6 rays of light fell down towards the ground and Simon appeared behind the man and roared. Dark burst. All for One got launched towards the 6 rays of light with a boom. The two stared at the smoke and they quickly jumped away when tendrils were launched towards them. However, All Might had appeared and caught the attack and roared, all the while spinning. Your fight is with me. Oklahoma Smash. After he said this, All for One spun into the air and Seagrain roared. Abyss break. The attack was sent towards All for One with another boom. Said man fell down towards the ground and stood up, all the while laughing like a madman. You can't defeat me with these measly attacks. Just as he said this, All Might appeared behind him and roared. Texas Smash. The wind pressure howled on his fist and almost made contact with the symbol of evil. But said man shouted. Ultimate quirk combination. His left arm grew and he launched his fist towards All Might. The two attacks collided and it shook the entire area and cracked the ground beneath the duo. All Might was going to overpower him, but All for One roared. Impact recoil plus shock inversion. The number 1 hero winced when his whole arm started to bleed. However, All Might saw Seagrain readying an attack. He gritted his teeth and roared. I won't lose. All for One replied back amused. And what do you think you will accomplish, 8th successor of One for All? As this was happening, Seagrain pointed one arm to the ground and one to the side and roared. True heavenly body, Seema. All Might noticed the clouds above them and he quickly jumped back from All for One. Said hero looked at All Might with a raised eyebrow. Why did you dash? But he didn't get to finish as a meteor appeared from the sky and reached All for One within a second. Boom! A massive crater was formed and the explosion is easily doubled the size of the surrounding buildings. Seagrain just huffed and grinned. I think I got him. He then spat out blood. All for One had launched a tendril through his shoulder and leg. Annoying brat, that hurt. As he was distracted, however, Simon had teleported All Might behind him and said hero roared. This is the end, All for One. United States of Smash. His punch connected with the villain's head and he launched the attack towards the ground that caused another boom. All Might huffed and stared down towards All for One, who was at his feet. Half of his head was gone and most of his body was now crushed. He looked away from the man, but just as he did, All for One activated his tendril and was about to pierce the number one hero on the side. But Seagrain had saw this and roared. Meteor! He was able to move All Might away from the tendril, but another one had pierced the number one hero on the side of his stomach. But said number one hero was able to destroy it with a punch just as it did. Flashback end. Izumi stared at her fist and clenched it. It has been 3 weeks since after the UST attack, and Lily had woke up in half of that time. Said girl was now trying to get the scarlet-haired girl's attention, but Izumi was thinking about what All Might had told her. The blonde hero told Izumi that after the sports festival she will be taking the provisional license exams. She sighed, and that's when Lily poked her forehead. Izumi blinked and stared at the brown-haired girl with a raised eyebrow. Lily smiled and spoke up. I asked if you are excited for the sports festival. The scarlet-haired girl smiled and nodded. Lily was about to speak up, but that's when Present Mike could be heard over the intercoms. Class 1A, head over to the stage and go where Midnight directs you. After everyone heard this, they stood up and made their way out of the waiting room. As the class made their way towards the end of the tunnel, they could hear the crowd's cheers and excitement. Half of the class gulped, but Izumi walked in front of them and walked onto the grass field towards the front of the podium. After her classmates had saw this, they followed her lead. As this was happening, other courses were lining up right next to Class 1A. 3 minutes later, Midnight appeared and stood on top of a podium. Said heroine, then spoke into the microphone. Welcome everyone to the sports festival for the first years. She then continued. Can the representative come up to give the speech? After Izumi heard this, she nodded and walked up towards the podium. She took the mic from Midnight and turned around. The scarlet-haired girl then spoke up. I hope that you all give it your best. Izumi then handed the mic back to Midnight and said heroine spoke into it. Alright, give a round of applause for the first year representative. After the crowd had calmed down, Midnight spoke up. Now we will see what the first event will be. As she said this, Midnight pressed a button and a big wheel appeared at her side. Midnight then spun said wheel. After a few seconds, it landed on obstacle race. She smiled and directed the students towards the tunnel behind them. The obstacle race will be around the stadium and it will start shortly. 5 minutes later. All of the contestants are now standing in the narrow tunnel and Izumi narrowed her eyes. So this is the first part of the test. As she thought, this present mic could be heard. Start. After he said this, Izumi muttered. Requip black-winged armor. She then jumped into the air and flew towards the edge of the tunnel. As Izumi did this, Shoto had launched his ice attack towards the ground. Todoroki looked up and muttered. Yeah, I didn't think that would get her. He then chased after the red-haired girl. Back with Izumi. She made it out of the tunnel and kept her pace to the first part of the race. As the scarlet-haired girl did this, present mic could be heard. Wow, Izumi Scarlet already reached the first part of the race. The robots. After he said this, a zero-pointer appeared and launched a swipe towards Izumi. Said girl dodged to the side and took note of the 50 robots. Requip Heaven's Wheel armor. All of the males in the crowd had a nosebleed at the sight, but it quickly stopped when All Might and Seagrain's killing intent reached the whole stadium. The redhead then roared. Scattered petals. As she said this, Izumi swung her blades towards the robots. Boom. Izumi smiled when all of the robots were gone and she took off once again. Todoroki was right behind her and Bakugo is following shortly behind. The redhead was now at the fall. But Izumi didn't even give a second glance and rocketed towards the landmines. Present Mike then shouted. Wow, Shota, your student is really something. Wasn't she the one who defeated the Nomu? Said man muttered something incoherent and responded. Yeah, she does train with All Might daily, at least according to her and the bruises on All Might's face. The pro heroes were muttering to themselves after they had heard this. But Izumi looked down towards the mines and grinned. 200 sword appeared behind her and she launched them towards said mines with a loud boom. She then made her way towards the tunnel and not a moment later, midnight could be heard. Winner Izumi Scarlet. Said girl smiled and stared at her father and gave him a thumbs up. All Might smiled and nodded. But that is the end of this part. If you enjoy this part, leave a like and subscribe. Also let me know how this part had came out.